Welcome to the Leader's Agenda, a podcast series dedicated to reimagining leadership within life sciences. My name is Tarja Huuskonen, and I'm your host as well as the CEO of Action for Results. I've had the opportunity to work with leaders all over the world, building new capabilities for innovation. The Leader's Agenda podcast invites insights and perspectives from some of the very best leaders of our time. Wisdom that you too can build into your own leader's agenda. So today's guest is Tony Ulwick. Welcome, Tony. You are a little bit of a trailblazer when it comes to innovation, and you've also been at it for quite a while. I have some facts and figures of your career innovation. It looks like you got into it early on, and you have since then founded a company called Strategyn that is about strategy and innovation. You've also been the inventor of an outcome-driven innovation, which we're going to talk a lot about today. There's a claim that you have made that if the industry players that have used outcome-driven innovation are achieving a success rate that is 5 times better than the industry average. So I'm going to ask you exactly how is that so, and what are the metrics over there. But most importantly, you're really someone who has put a lot of your entire life to thinking about innovation and how we get better at innovation. You've also written a few books. I love the name of the first book. That was What Customers Want. That's a great title. And the next one, I actually have it here, is this Jobs to be Done. And this is the theory to practice, because I think that theory has been around there, but this is actually promising to tell people how to use it. So welcome. I'm so happy to have in our show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invite.
All right. So I know we have so much to talk about, but because it's been now almost 30 years of innovation for you, I have to ask you, where are we today? In that time that you have spent in innovation, has a lot of progress been made? Are we a lot smarter, better innovators today than we were before? And so what's the current status?
That was such a great question, because you're right. I've been at this for 30 years, and when I look back, we've made progress in a sense that we've turned innovation into a science. But what I see is companies are still approaching innovation pretty much the same way they were approaching it 30 years ago, and a lot of the problems that were being faced back then are still being faced today. So I'd say even though we've made improvements on how innovation can be executed, I'd say that companies are still very slow in their adoption. And it's funny because I read a book years ago that said, for business ideas to take hold, it takes 20 to 30 years. And this one's pushing the limit, but
well, I'm just going to, didn't you come up with this outcome-driven innovation almost 20 years ago? 30 years ago? All right, so maybe we have a big opportunity in the next couple of years to see something different.
Exactly, let's hope so.
So I actually was reading one of your articles, and this I think was in the Harvard Business Review, and there was a statement here that says, the innovation journey for many companies is little more than hopeful wandering through customer interviews. Such unsystematic inquiry may occasionally turn up interesting tidbits of information, but it rarely uncovers the best ideas or an exhausting set of opportunities for growth. That's quite the statement, Tony.
Well, innovation in most cases is truly just still a guessing game. And in my experience at IBM before I started Strategyn, I worked on a product called the PC Junior that failed miserably in the marketplace. In fact, the headline in the Wall Street Journal the day after we introduced it read, "The PC Junior is a flop." And it was. And that got me very interested in innovation as a process. I thought, how could a company like IBM, with all its vast resources, make such a mistake? Well, I learned pretty quickly that it's not just IBM, it's many companies that struggle with the same problem.
Yeah.
And as I've analyzed over the years, many people approach innovation more or less as a guessing game. There's guessing, there's experimenting, there's hypothesizing, there's iterating, there's pivoting. And they're doing all this because they don't know any other approach, or they're very comfortable with this approach. But the truth is, it doesn't have to be a guessing game. And that's what we've proven over the years. We can take the guesswork out of innovation by executing it, I'll say, in the complete opposite way that most companies execute the innovation process.
Okay, so now I want to hear more about that. So this concept of outcome-driven innovation, before we get into what that really is all about, can we kind of go back to the term innovation itself, because we use that term quite loosely. And of course, our audience is life sciences, medtech companies, pharmaceutical companies. That's a very, very long product development process. Sometimes we look at that entire process as the innovation process. So in context of this conversation, are we talking about the front end? Are we talking about something different?
Yeah, we're talking about the front end. So everything before the development process, right?
Okay.
So, and ideally, the ideal input into the development process is a product concept that you know is going to win in the marketplace. Right? That should be the output of the innovation process in our language. And then once that winning product goes into development, it follows the typical development rules, goes into launch. So, in my view, there's not much broken after products enter development. Most of the problem with innovation is occurring before the products get into development. In other words, companies are great at creating products. They're just not great at creating the right products. So if we could only make sure that the right products go into the development process, that would dramatically reduce failure rates at the back end.
And that's also really important in an industry like life sciences, where the development cycle is 6 years, 10 years, sometimes 12 years, right? So if at the end of that 12 years you have the wrong product, oh boy. But that puts a lot of pressure onto that front end. And sometimes I've heard it called the fuzzy front end. Can outcome-driven innovation make the fuzziness go away? What does it look like?
Yeah, that was the entire goal of outcome-driven innovation, is to take that fuzziness out of it. And like I said, the goal of innovation is to come up with a solution that you know is going to win in the marketplace before development begins. So let's break that down. What does that mean? That means we have to think about why people even buy products to begin with, right? They buy products to get a job done. Okay, well, let's say that's true. If they buy products to get a job done, then a winning product would get the job done better than its predecessor. All right.
Yes,
So what do we mean by better, right? Better might mean faster, more predictably, better result, lower cost, right? So we can work this backwards. So what that means is we have to come up with a product that gets a job done about 15 to 20% better than previous solutions in order to be very confident that it's going to win in the marketplace. So these are numbers that we've determined over the years, and you could just test this on yourself. Like, would you switch from one brand to another brand if it promises to get the job done 1% better,
right,
or 2% better, or 5?
And especially if I'm a hospital system that has put a lot of investment in also training people on certain products that we are using. So it's got to be a good reason why I'm switching.
That's exactly right. So that means you have to get the job done significantly better,
right?
Which means that you probably have to get the job done faster, more predictably, with better results and at a lower cost. Right? If you can do all that, then you're going to hit that threshold, that benchmark. So then the question becomes, well, how do we figure out how to do that before development even begins? Which means we have to define needs as the metrics that people use to measure success when they get these jobs done. And these metrics relate to getting the job done faster and more predictably with a better result. This is why we call this outcome-driven innovation, because we take the job the person's trying to execute We break it down into its component parts and understand at a real granular level how they measure success along each step of the way. And we do this in our own lives with our own products too. Like when you're cooking a meal, for example, you may say, well, yeah, I'm trying to minimize the likelihood of overcooking the meal. Well, you may not even say it, but if someone were to ask you, the last time you cooked a meal, what were you trying to achieve or what were you trying to avoid? You tell them these things. I want to minimize the likelihood of undercooking the meal. I want to minimize the likelihood that it's cooked unevenly throughout. I want to minimize the time it takes to clean up after. And you start getting all these statements that relate to getting the job done faster and more predictably with a better result. And the funny thing is, it's not as if there's 4 or 5 of these statements in a given market. There's usually 100 or more of these outcomes. And these are the customer's true needs, right? And what I find so interesting in many companies, and we've run a lot of studies on this, in most companies, there isn't agreement as to what a customer need even is. So and this is one of the reasons why innovation is still such a guessing game. Companies know that they're trying to create solutions that address unmet needs, but marketing, sales, development, R&D, they don't agree on what a need is. They can't agree on what the needs are or which are unmet. And so they debate what solutions they should be pursuing without the knowledge of the targets, in effect, right? The outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And this is why innovation is such a guessing game. What we try to do with outcome-driven innovation is to build on this basic principle that people buy products to get a job done and think about the job as a process, break it down step by step, figure out what are the metrics people are using to measure success along each step of the way. Interventional cardiologists want to minimize the likelihood of piercing a vessel as they're trying to move through a tortuous vessel, right? They want to minimize the time it takes to cross the lesion. There's very specific things that they are trying to achieve as they're trying to restore blood flow to an artery, for example. And this is true in every life science procedure, right? People are buying products to get a whole series of jobs done, and each with its own set of metrics, each with its own set of customers, and understanding how people measure success up front getting the job done is the only thing that's going to allow you to create a product that you know is going to get the job done better. So
it's really needing to pay some attention to what they are doing today in some ways for context, right? But also not getting too much into it, because what you really want to understand is what matters the most for them. What is it that they're trying to achieve along the way, and what their success metrics are along the way and at the end.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What we're trying to, we rarely ask them about what are they doing, because what they're doing is in solution space, is the way we say it, right? What we want to know is what are they trying to do? Right? What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to avoid as they go about and get the job done? And how do they measure what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to avoid? Right? So we're quite literally putting metrics in place that tie what they're trying to achieve to what the engineers can go eventually produce, right? Like if you know that they're trying to minimize the likelihood of piercing a vessel when moving through a tortuous part of a vessel, then you can come up with solutions that will address that specifically, right?
Yeah.
And that amongst all the other needs, right? As I mentioned before, you got to get the job done about 15% better or more, which means you're not going to win just by addressing one need a little bit better, right? You're going to have to address 5 or 10 or 20 needs significantly better in order to really move the needle. So if you can't agree on what a need is or what the needs are or which are unmet, you're just going to randomly guess at this and hope that you come up with a solution that does get the job done significantly better, which most companies don't. And this is why they fail at innovation.
So as I listen to you, Tony, what strikes me is, we're not just, we're not innovating products, we're innovating the way people get their jobs done.
That's right. The products just happen to be a solution. And,
yes.
and when you say products, it could be software, hardware, services, right? It's any of those things. People are just trying to get a job done. They're looking for a way to get it done better. And companies come along with a solution in the form of hardware, software, or service that they can then hire, in essence, to get the job done. So what we're studying is the job they're trying to get done, not the product, right? So this requires a little different mindset and tool set when it comes to thinking about innovation.
I was just going to say a lot of the traditional setup for new product development, of course, we have cross-functional teams, but we still very vertically inclined in many organizations. Marketing go off and talk to the customer, bring us some customer needs, and then, we're going to look at them. And now we're trying to really bring cross-functional teams together much earlier and change that paradigm. But in context of specifically this innovation process and understanding those jobs to be done, whose job is it to understand, and how do they do that?
Well, let's break out the responsibilities, because there's people who have to go get the information, and then people that have to use the information.
Yes.
Right now, a lot of people are going to use the information, but only a handful of people really have to know how to get the information.
Mm-hmm.
And they can be qualitative researchers, quantitative researchers, but generally what they have to do is to first define the market. Now, we're going to define a market not as a use case or a vertical or a technology or a product. We're going to define the market as a group of people getting a job done. So it could be interventional cardiologists trying to restore blood flow to an artery, right? That's a group of people and the job they're trying to get done. So we're going to define a market that way as opposed to anything else. Now, the reason that's a good thing is because that market is stable over time. It's independent of solution. So different technologies can come along over the next 10, 20 years to get that job done better, but the market doesn't go away, right? I like using the music example of LPs to CDs to MP3s to streaming service, right? The technology's changed dramatically over 30 years or so, but the underlying job is still the same. People are trying to listen to music, right? Now, if you can define your market in a way that makes it stable, then you don't get disrupted as easily as you would if you're defining your market around the product or the technology. Right. So that's the starting point. You have a nice stable starting point to understand the market. Then the second step is to uncover the customer's needs. This is the job of the qualitative researcher. You can have a handful of these in your organization, and they can go investigate any market and figure out what are all the metrics people are using to measure success as they go about and get the job done. And they can collect them. People know what these are. There's no such thing as latent needs in this paradigm, because
that's a really sorry to interrupt, but that's a really important point you're making there, because a lot of times in the more traditional market research, we talk about customers also the needs that the customers don't even know they have.
Yeah.
Right. Are you saying there aren't such things?
That's one of the problems with innovation, right? The traditional approach, you can easily think that customers have needs they can't articulate if you define needs around solutions. Yeah. It goes back to like Henry Ford's quote, people, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Or Steve Jobs, people don't know what they want until they see it. It's funny how people can interpret those statements. They interpret them in thinking that, well, customers don't know their needs. But that's not what they're saying, right? What they're really saying is, if I asked people what solution they would have wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Or if I ask, if people don't know what solution they want until they see it. Now that's true, but it doesn't mean people don't know their needs. What it means is you can't define a solution as a need or a need as a solution. They're two different things, right? Solutions satisfy needs. So that means a need has to be something else. And the way we think about this is the need is now the metric that people use to measure success for getting a job done. And they know these, they can articulate them, they think about them all the time, right? So that whole concept that people don't know what they want goes away, right?
So that qualitative researcher, is that someone with more of a marketing background typically in an organization? Do we find these people in organizations? And the second question adjacent to that to me is, we also have lately really found more and more companies making sure that people from R&D, for instance, will be much more closely involved with the customer in the early phases, particularly really
Yeah.
understanding the workflow that the customer is using for whatever job they are doing. So can you help me understand these two things in context of the teams inside organizations who need to do this work?
Sure. It's often the case that the responsibility for needs gathering falls in the marketing domain,
Yeah.
but a traditional marketing mind is not necessarily the best mind to be collecting these outcome statements. What we often see is it's process people. It could be on the engineering side, or it could be people in marketing that just think process very well, right? They can be
Yeah.
black belts. They're that kind of thinkers. So instead of seeing a product, they can see behind the product to what the people are trying to do, and they can extract from them their process view, right?
That's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a little different discipline than some traditional marketing disciplines or even some traditional research disciplines. We often hear that observational research is the way to go. Well, I would have to disagree with that, because observational research only allows you to see what customers are doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what they're doing is in solution space. What we're trying to do as researchers is to figure out what are they trying to do. And the
Yeah.
only way you can find that out is to ask them, right? So if you're watching someone do something, you have to keep saying to them, well, why did you do that, right? What are you trying to achieve by doing that? Or what are you trying to
Right.
avoid? And the truth is, you never have to get into what they're doing, right? When we do
Right.
our interviews with customers, we just ask them, so what's the first thing you're trying to accomplish? And then what's the next thing? And we quite literally have them go from beginning to end through every little minute step that they're trying to go through to get the job done in order to extract those metrics. And that just requires a process mind and a process discipline. So whether that responsibility sits in marketing or development, R&D, that's less of an issue in my mind. It's more of, do you have the right person collecting that information for you?
Now, our companies, you worked with a lot of different companies, including in the life sciences space. Are we building that capability today?
Some certainly are. Absolutely. Yeah. We've worked with about 35 of the top 40 global life sciences companies, and they're heading in that direction. And I find it interesting, as a industry as a whole, they are the industry moving in this direction the fastest. In other words, they're adopting this thinking faster than any other industry. And I think, Taj, the reason is what you said earlier. There's long product life cycles here.
Yes.
If you get it wrong, that's a 10-year cycle you miss. That's 10
And
years
you're
of revenue.
talking, and the cost of that, you're talking millions and millions of dollars going down the drain.
Exactly.
Right.
So in this space, you can't afford to be wrong, right?
Right.
In the lean startup space, apparently they can afford to be wrong, right? Because they hypothesize, they pivot, they get refunded, they just keep going until they hit something. But in an established business, you can't do that, right? You have to make sure that your next iteration of the product is going to get the job done significantly better, right?
Got it.
Or risk losing share to a competitor.
Absolutely. So a couple questions here. You mentioned earlier, well, there's really can be hundreds and hundreds of needs, right? So then how do we discern out of all of those needs the few that are truly the value drivers from the customer's perspective, the big ones that are going to make a difference and give us a winning product? And then also, how does competition play into this?
Sure. So once we have a set of statements, we put them in a survey that goes out to hundreds of customers, sometimes thousands, depending on the industry. And we ask people, it could be interventional cardiologists, to tell us, how important is it to you that you minimize the time it takes to cross the lesion? And then how satisfied are you with your ability, using the tools you use today, to minimize the time it takes to cross the lesion? So we're getting these two data points. How important are all these needs, and to what degree are they satisfied given the solutions that they're using today? And we ask them what solutions they're using today. So we know that. So this comes into play when we talk about competition here in a second. But what this does is it reveals the true value drivers. In other words,
Mhm.
those needs that are really important and not well satisfied go to the top of the list, right? That's where you can add value, right? But there's the other side of the equation too. There may be some needs that are unimportant that are also very satisfied, meaning you could be
Yeah.
spending money on things that don't matter, right? And
Yeah.
over satisfying the customers. So when it comes to innovating, getting the job done better and more cheaply, you can now see which needs to focus on to get the job done better, and then which of these to focus on to get the job done more cheaply. So this is why we can improve the innovation success rate so dramatically, because what are the chances that a team would just randomly come up with the top 10 or 20 unmet needs in a market if they didn't agree on what market they're in or what a need is or what the needs are, right? And of course,
Right.
it's very slim. But once a team can agree on the market, the set of needs, and the top unmet needs,
Mm-hmm.
they can move forward very quickly to go come up with the right solutions. And this has really been the missing ingredient, right? I mentioned before, the goal of innovation is to make sure the product that goes into development will win in the marketplace. And
Yes.
if you've discovered the top 15 or 20 unmet needs and you've conceptualized solutions to address all those top 20 unmet needs, you can be pretty comfortable that your product is going to win in the marketplace, right? Because
So what's interesting about this research and the methodology that you're describing, I could see using that more broadly also, where we might be really looking at a whole platform that, for instance, or a cadence of products that will come out of this research, um, because what we're discovering is actually very rich, and some of that may be more on the core product side, as well as perhaps service, those other things that are really important for the customer as well.
yeah, that's exactly right. Because jobs to be done are agnostic of the solution type. So
Yeah.
we worked in the agriculture space, for example, on growing crops, and we looked at the job of growing a crop. And of course, there's a whole bunch of equipment and machinery involved in
Yeah.
growing crops, but 50 of the top 150 outcomes had nothing to do with equipment. It had to do with information, right? Where growers wanted to have the right information at the right time to make the right decisions.
Right.
And we pointed this out to our client. This is 12 years ago now. This was the beginning of digitalized farming, and they worked very hard over the years to begin to address those 50 unmet needs with a information-based solution. It was a software solution. And
Yeah.
this company at the time wasn't in the software space, so this is a big stretch for them. But that's to your point, right? Customers are trying to get a job done. Companies have to figure out the best solution and the best platforms to invest in order to make it happen. And more we see, especially in this space, that it requires all three. Many times companies have to invest in hardware, software, and services to get the entire job done.
Okay, so now because life sciences is going through quite a revolution of its own, right? So
Yeah.
we're looking at, and in some ways, by the way, the pace of the change in this industry may have accelerated as a result of the pandemic and some of the things that have just happened in the last couple of years. So what do we have now? We have artificial intelligence coming in. We have already the digitization is all over the place, right? We have robotics. We have, but we still have the basics. We still have drug companies that at the end have to make the drug, right? We still have to figure out a way how we deliver that drug to the patient. We also recognizing that that doesn't all happen within the four walls of one company anymore. So more and more we see collaborations, co-developments, partnerships. And within that complexity, I think one of the struggles is who is the customer, depending on who you are within that ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm a medtech company and I'm a B2B business, and let's just say I'm in drug delivery, so I make anything from syringes to patch pumps to get drug into a human being. Who's my customer? Is it
Yeah.
that drug company? Is it the patient? Is it
Yeah.
the hospital? Is it the surgeon? Who is it?
And that's the fun it's associated
That's
with
the
being
fun
in such
part.
a complicated market. The answer is you have a bunch of customers. Now, we generally categorize all you customers into three types.
Yeah.
We've got what we call the job executor. So that's the person who's using the product to get the job done. But then we have the buyer.
Yeah.
Now, in life sciences, the buyer and the user are almost always different people, right? And they are trying to get different jobs done. They have different set of needs.
Yeah.
So that adds complication. And then you have people who support the product throughout its life cycle. You have people that have to retrieve it and store it and transport it and set it up. That could be a nursing staff. You have biomeds that have to clean the product or sterilize it after its use, especially like a drug infusion pump, for example.
Yeah.
And now we've like hitting the drug infusion pump space too. Who is the job executor? Is it the caregiver? Is it the patient? Could it be both? And they
Yeah.
are both job executors. It depends, and they're both trying to get the same job done. It depends if you have a caregiver trying to help it do it for you, or if you're doing it yourself. But they're both trying to get the same job done.
Correct.
Then you have a pharmacist, for example, that has to load the drug infusion pump with the right drug and the right delivery mechanism and so on to make sure that's going to work. It's as if I'll give a contrast. The consumer space has it easy, right? Like if you're a toothbrush manufacturer,
Mm-hmm.
one person buys the product, uses the product, disposes of the product, cleans the product, right? So you have one customer that does everything,
Yeah.
performs all functions. But in a number of spaces, health sciences life sciences being one of them, it's one of the most complicated areas. And this is why it's so important to have a model that can help point out that there are three types of customers, and they each are trying to do different things, and they each need to be considered in order to win in the marketplace. Now, what we can also talk about here is how to prioritize them.
Yeah.
What we've learned over the years is that if you can help the job executor get the job done significantly better, then the buyer is going to want to buy the product. Or
Mm-hmm.
if you can help the support people reduce their support costs, if it's easier for the biomed to clean the product, if it's easier
Yeah.
to transport it, if disposal costs are less, then the buyer is going to want to buy it, right?
Sure.
So generally the way we prioritize it, we say, let's go study the job executor, make sure we can get the job done a lot better for them. If we can, then we'll invest in that solution and then go talk to the support team and the buyer to understand their role in this thing too, and to see if we can address everybody's unmet needs.
So this the whole body of knowledge that emerged some years ago started in pharmaceutical side and now is across life sciences, really understanding the ecosystem within which
Yeah.
The users live, so to speak.
Yeah.
That is extremely important as a basis for being able to use this outcome-driven approach, sounds like.
Exactly, because you're aiming, the approach works the same. People are trying to get a job done. You can understand that job at the outcome level and work
Yeah.
to satisfy it. But there's different kinds of jobs, right?
Yeah.
And I know that complicates things a bit, but there's the job of the job executor, which is what the reason the product even exists, right? But then the buyer's trying to maybe reduce the patient's length of stay in the hospital, or they have some financial metrics that they're using to decide whether
Yeah.
to go with vendor A or vendor B, and so on. So as long as you can categorize them and show where the pieces fit, you can begin to understand them. What becomes so complicated is when there is no framework and you just have all these inputs from all these people and you can't organize them or make sense of them.
I think the other complexity, Tony, is that we've kind of in a sense, we've expanded our development environment to really be much more this co-development environment, but how we go about development hasn't necessarily caught up with that. So each organization involved within any part of that development or component of the final solution, they do their own research. They try to figure out who their customer is, and they do their own thing. But I wonder how often we actually come together to say, okay, this is the market that we're going after. And how do we combine our forces and really look at it holistically? Have you had any instances where, or can you give any advice as to what should we do differently in this partnership model?
Yeah, somebody has to own the customer relationship or understand it, right? And I love the way you brought that up and framed that, because it's pretty rare that any one company is going to go study the needs of everybody in the ecosystem,
right?
Because they don't generally own the whole ecosystem. But if you were to go uncover the unmet needs of everyone in the ecosystem, you would have a great competitive advantage and a great partnering advantage, because you can go to other people that are offering pieces of the ecosystem and go point out to them where their customers' unmet needs are.
Yeah.
Or better yet, you can go come up with solutions either with them or without them that address their customers' problems. Right.
Yes.
Right. So I'll give an example outside the healthcare space, but this was with working with Rome Haas a number of years back. They make chemicals that go into paints that get recommended by architects, that get applied by contractors, that people see in rooms as they occupy a building or a home. Right. Who's the customer? Right. Now, as Rome Haas, they could have easily said, well, let's just go talk to paint manufacturers because that's who buys our products. So let's just stop there. And we encourage them to go all the way through the whole ecosystem, to study the architects, to study the contractors who have to apply the paint, to study the occupants of the building. And they had a knowledge and understanding of the customer's needs throughout the entire ecosystem. When they went to the paint manufacturer to show them what they had learned and why this new product concept was not only going to address their needs, but the needs of everyone else downstream from them, they were excited, right?
I am sure, yes.
Yeah. And so I think that's the kind of thing that needs to take place. Companies just have to be bold enough to want to own the research across the ecosystem. What I find funny is, and Rome Haas hesitated there too. They said, aren't we going to ruin relationships with our paint manufacturers if we go talk to their customers? And the answer is no, you're not. Especially if you come back to them and say, here's your customers' unmet needs.
Yeah.
Because keep in mind, the paint manufacturer, they can't agree on what a need is.
Right.
They don't know what the needs are. They don't know which needs are unmet. So they're suffering from all the same innovation issues that everybody else is. So those companies that truly want to be the master at innovation can be the innovation champions within their ecosystem and help guide the other partners to do the right things.
That's a really important point. And I think that's a strategic conversation, depending a little bit on what kind of a company you are. But let's just say, for instance, right now, diagnostics is a big thing, right? I mean, we are using, we've seen an opportunity in diagnostics that like nothing before. And diagnostic is also, that's area that takes us right to the consumer, to the, we've seen that now with the COVID tests, for instance. Yeah. So there's this whole body of knowledge that is needed. And so can that diagnostic company actually be educating the pharma company on something that the pharma company may not have even thought about, right? And so these are really important conversations inside the company, but also for strategic partnerships, which we can kind of take the strategic partnerships up a notch if we do this right.
That's right, and that helps inform M&A decisions as well, things like that, where so that you're buying other companies that will help get more of the job done better, right? So you can make them more strategically.
Which actually brings me to a couple of questions. We got some questions from our listeners, And one of those questions was actually about hunting grounds, and saying that when we establishing hunting grounds early on, is there an ideal balance within life sciences now between organic or inorganic innovation, or is there something that we should be sort of thinking about in that early space to be able to get an advantage, if you
Sure.
will?
Yeah, when I hear the term hunting grounds, that takes me to some of the work that I've read of recently that it's really describing markets as the way we define markets. There are groups of people and jobs to be done, right? So we're trying to figure out where to hunt. In other words, what markets should we go after? And we do a lot of this work for clients where they want to evaluate different markets. And the first thing we tell them is that we need to define all the markets in the same way, right? Now, this sounds logical, of course, but I can't tell you how many times we'd get into an exercise like this, and some markets are defined as verticals, some markets are defined as use cases, some are defined as technologies, some are defined as demographics. They're all defined differently. So you can only imagine how hard it is to pick one over the other if they're not all labeled the same way, right?
Right.
So the first thing we do is we look at all the markets that they're considering and put them into this language. Who's the job executor? What's the job they're trying to get done? Now, once you have your list of 10 or 20 or 50, whatever the number is, of possible markets you want to enter, then you can start evaluating them using a pretty interesting set of criteria. So for example, would you rather be in a market that has 3,000 job executors or 30 million job executors? Would you rather be in a market that has a growing number of executors or a decreasing number? Would you rather be in a market that's underserved or overserved? Would you rather be in a market where people are willing to pay more or not willing to pay more? Now, I could keep going, right? But you get the general idea that there are a whole series of questions you can ask that would say, this group of people in that job is far more attractive to go after than that group of people in that
So that's
job.
your discernment process.
That's the discernment process.
Right.
Yeah, and on our website, in our resources section, we have a matrix. It's an Excel spreadsheet that I think we have 42 different metrics on there that we use to help companies go through that exercise. So that's free to download if your audience would like to take a look at that.
Right, right. So may I ask another question that kind of ties to this, but it's a little bit different. And we talked about this a little bit, but this is specifically technology innovation related question. And so we talk a lot about product innovation, but the reality of it is that there's these huge technology platforms that we of course build, particularly in the medtech side. And some of those platforms have a life of 20, 30, even 40 years. So we're looking at a technology that evolves over time. So in thinking about technology innovation, this is the question. Sometimes the technology gets ahead of the customer needs, and we are looking for a nail because we have a hammer. So at the same time, looking 10 years out into the future, customer needs are difficult to articulate. How should we think or go about innovating for the future and not get caught into leading with a hammer?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So a couple of things there. The way the question was framed, it talked about how customers can't articulate needs 10 years into the future.
Yeah. That's
another misnomer, right? You can't articulate the best solution 10 years from now.
Right.
But why should you as a customer, right? You're not a technologist, you're not the expert. That's not your goal. But if you study the job the customer is trying to get done, that job is stable over long periods of time. Interventional cardiologists trying to restore blood flow in an artery, that's been the same job for decades, right?
Yes.
So can you understand the needs associated with getting that job done? Are customers still going to be satisfied with minimizing the time it takes to cross the lesion, right?
Yeah.
If they're still not satisfied then, that's still going to be an unmet need 10 years from now. right? In other words, we can discover all the metrics associated with the job to be done today. And when we see all our value drivers, all these unmet needs that are listed there, and we can't figure out how to solve them today, and a technology comes along that could solve it, that's when you want to invest in that technology, right? You want to be the first to go invest in that, and you know what you're going to go do with it. That's the beauty. Most technology comes along and people saying, this sounds like a great technology. What do I do with it? And they keep trying to find a home for it, right?
So the technology becomes a constraint, doesn't it? At that point, right?
That's right.
So if I build it, they must come somehow, or I got to find somebody.
Well, I've got a couple interesting stories around that. So, we worked with Motorola years back when they came out with voice command technology for their radio products. And the way they were about to go implement the technology would have satisfied 3 unmet needs. Now, what we showed them was the list of all the unmet needs. And they said, oh, well, we didn't know that, but we could modify the technology in this way and we could address this one. We could do this and we could address these 2 or 3. Well, it turns out they made some minor adjustments to the way they were going to release the technology and addressed 11 unmet needs, not just 3. So the technology was quickly adopted and used, right? That's always the goal. There's always going to be new technologies coming along, digitalization, blockchain, whatever, right? And as these technologies come along, you want to see, well, how can I use them to get this job done better? How can I use them to drive these metrics in the positive direction, right?
So then in that front end, fuzzy front end, that is no longer fuzzy because we now understand the needs. So now I have the needs and we've done some great research. We've done some discernment. At which point what's that cross-functional team? It's coming together. And so now I want to bring my technology experts. I want to bring my R&D folks. Probably want to bring people from operations, from manufacturing. I want to look at it holistically to see where's the opportunity. Tell me a little bit more about how far do I go in that process in the front end? Because at some point there, I also have to start thinking about the internal value drivers and the trade-offs that we have to start making.
Yeah. So you asked earlier too, like who's responsible for getting the data? And we talked about the researchers go get the data. So the researchers gather all the need statements, they quantify them in the survey, they get the results back, they analyze them. They can tell you, are there segments of people with different unmet needs? They can lay out all the value drivers by segment. So you can do a lot of stuff. So then the question is, as you just posed, how do you engage the organization around that data? Now, so we do this we call them ideation sessions, but you might as well call them alignment sessions.
I love that. So alignment sessions, yes. Now, that means agreement.
Right? It means agreement, right? And in these sessions, like we have all the people you mentioned. It's the technologists, the researchers, the marketers. Sometimes we bring in customers, but we all sit together. And the first thing is to get on the same page as to what is a need, what are the needs, which are unmet. Now, it often takes 2 hours just to get the room of people to agree those are the unmet needs, right? Those 10 things that you have in priority order based on quantitative data, those are the unmet needs. Now, it's all time well spent because this is the truly transformational part. If you can take a team from a place where they don't agree on what a need is to they agree on what all the unmet needs are, that's the transformation. Because now they're going to work together. The only debate is, well, what's the best solution, right? Because they're not debating the problem anymore. So now we're in solution space, and we can start working with them outcome by outcome through these alignment ideation sessions, where they are coming up with ideas to address the unmet needs, but they all agree on the unmet needs. And this speeds up the ideation aspect dramatically. I'll give you a quick example. We worked with the Bosch team. They were trying to enter the North American circular saw market. And we applied this approach. We understood all the needs, figured out which were unmet. We found a segment of people that had 14 unmet needs. We presented it to the team, and it took them just 3 hours to conceptualize a brand new circular saw. It was their CS20 circular saw. They brought it to market. It was the top-selling circular saw for over 10 years in North America. As they said, it's not as if we didn't have these ideas before. The problem is we've had thousands of ideas before, and we didn't know which ones really would move the needle. Right?
Which ones would be the real value drivers, right?
Exactly.
That's amazing. So then how do you in that process though, or I feel that sometimes we may get to the value drivers, but then all kinds of internal considerations come to play and we start trading those value drivers. Well, what about this and what about that? Yeah. And suddenly, we limiting the possibilities. Yeah. How do we handle that in that process?
Yeah, it's a great question because you can put constraints on prematurely, right? And then really miss some big opportunities. So once you know what those top 15, 20 unmet needs are, we encourage teams to figure out how to address every one of them and not look at them up front and say, well, we don't want to do that one because that's going to cost too much, or we don't want to do that one because we don't have the capability. Right. Before you go there, let's just figure out a way to address the need that doesn't cost so much. So in other words, we're trying to find the solution that will drive the level of satisfaction for the outcome for the lowest cost, lowest effort, lowest risk. That's what we're always focused on. And so the first iteration of an idea, maybe it moves the needle on satisfaction, but it costs a lot.
Yes.
So then the next iteration of the idea, we say, well, how do you get that level of satisfaction, but take the cost out? And so now the next iteration is high satisfaction, lower cost, but maybe that increases the technical risk. And then we say, well, how do you then reduce the technical risk? So we're working through ideation. It's not just about having the idea, right? It's about having an idea that gets the job done significantly better at low cost, low effort, low risk, right? Now you can get the job done better and cheaper. And and so we just work through each outcome in a very systematic way like that to make all that happen so that you're not making the wrong trade-offs prematurely.
And within that process, you can also, and I think the technical assessment becomes very important there because that may also lead you to a solution that is not within the four walls of your company. This is the point where I may be looking for a partner, for instance, so that I can still move forward because I have a winning proposition from a customer perspective.
Yeah, that's right. We were working with Arm & Hammer's animal nutrition group, and they ran into the situation where they figured out they were only getting part of the job done. There was a step in the job that was missing, and they went out and made the case for acquiring a company that would plug right into that part of the job, which they did. And so now
they knew what they were looking for.
They knew,
which is another problem, which we won't go into today, but we often build all these partnerships and make investments, but not really knowing why. We don't know that we can get the right value from it. So this is it's an interesting conversation. I have a feeling I have to bring it back for some more. But just so that we can get to a couple more of our questions from the folks who sent questions beforehand, let me go to one more thing here. And this is about measuring innovation. Now, I want to bring that back to the introduction because you did say that the results are 5 times better when you're using outcome-driven innovation. So let's talk about measurement. How do we measure impact of innovation? And how do we do it holistically, knowing that it may not just be about the product, it may be about a lot of other things based on what we just discussed.
Now, so we have a lot of conversation with clients about this, and it's very interesting because, of course, the ultimate is that 5x improvement on innovation success rate, and quicker to market, right? Yeah. Of course, is another, and risk reduction. So those are all important things, but they're all after the fact measures, right? Yeah. So being a process guy myself, I love thinking about, well, what are the predictive metrics? Like, what do we have to make sure we do up front so that the product that we put into development is known to win in the marketplace? Like, how can we be certain the products we're putting will win in the market? All right, so let's look at the metrics upstream of that to figure out what is it going to take to make sure a winning product's going in. All right, well, we have to agree on the market that we're in. We
Mm-hmm.
have to agree on what a need is, what the needs are, which needs are unmet.
Mm-hmm.
We have to agree that the solutions for each of those needs will increase the level of satisfaction. And then we have to agree that the collective set of solutions that we've created will get the job done 15% better or more. If we can prove all that to ourselves, we know we're going to win in the marketplace. So it's those metrics that are really the valuable metrics, right?
Yes.
It's just getting, it goes back to alignment. Let's get everyone on the same page. What I find interesting is everybody in the organization wants to create value for the customer. They all do. Marketing, sales, development, R&D. That's what people live for, to go create value for other people.
Yes.
The problem is they don't know how, or they don't agree on how people measure value, right? They all have their own view. But if you can align them on all those points and they sit together and go, we can create significant value for our customers by addressing these 10,
Yeah.
15 value drivers, they're all in, right?
And like you said, in those sessions that you facilitate internally, you might also bring customers into those. You might do some additional, engagements as you go along. I'm assuming also that now we talk a lot about, once we get to development, we have agile development, we have all these different. So now we moving into the solution space. We're not saying that you shouldn't be engaging customer there. You are, but you're engaging the customer there now from a different perspective. You know what you're trying to resolve. You are really testing that solution space separately. Is that right?
That's exactly right. You've solved the big mystery up front, right? You know what
Yes.
product you're trying to create and what outcomes you're trying to achieve before you go into development. So development isn't in charge of defining the product concept and what the product has to do. That's already been defined. What development has to do now is design a product that will address all those needs, but do it in a way that will address all the consumption jobs. Make it easy to install, make the pump easy to set up, make the pump easy to clean, make it easy to dispose of. So there's still a lot of design work that has to go along there.
Definitely. Reliability, all of those things, right?
But those are all for the product support team that has to support the product throughout its life cycle, right? That's a different set of jobs, but they can still use the same approach that we've talked about to understand the installation process, for example, or to understand, they can go to biomeds and say, tell me all about the job of restoring the device to its original form for use or for reuse. And they can take you through that process, and they can tell you what outcomes they're trying to achieve and where they're underserved. So developers could use the same approach to address or gain insights on addressing those consumption chain jobs. And take it one step further. When it comes to go-to-market strategy, the go-to-market strategy is usually aimed at the buyer, right? And again, you can use this technique to go to the buyer and figure out what job are they trying to get done. Are they trying to, reduce the patient's length of stay? Are they trying to, minimize the likelihood of recurrence? Whatever the high-level financial metric is, and whatever the other sub-outcomes are, financial outcomes are knowable. So you can build your go-to-market strategy aimed at the buyer using this technique as well.
Yeah. What's interesting about that complexity factor again is that I think you can also have conflicting needs by those customer categories. So, and I forgot to ask you this earlier when we were talking about the research that you do. And you said, okay, well, the fun comes in these complex industries where we have all these layers of customers. What if they have very conflicting needs? So you just brought up a really good example: the hospital buyer versus the surgeon. They may look at things very differently, and sometimes that doesn't. Who resolves the conflict? Where do we resolve the conflict?
Well, the conflict is in solution space, not in need space. So the buyer can want whatever they want. They can want lowest cost and reduced patient length of stay. Whatever they want is what they want. Whatever the job executor wants is what they want. The conflict has to be resolved in solution space. If you can't come up with a solution that addresses both needs, or if you address this need for the job executor, it negatively impacts the need for the buyer, then that's a problem in solution space. So
Yes.
that goes to ideation. You'd say, well, how do we solve for both, right? There's techniques like trees, the TRIZ,
Yeah.
that is great for these technical kind of breakthroughs, right? How do you solve these conflicting things? So very doable, right?
But the important thing is to surface what those
Yeah,
conflicts are so that we can actually deal with it. We can't resolve what we don't know.
that's
So
exactly right.
so we have to do that research. Okay, so I want to change gears for a little bit. This is the leader's agenda. And we said, well, things haven't exactly progressed all that fast in any industry in terms of moving the notch up a little bit on innovation and how we go about that, especially that early part. Um, how are we going to change that? And and what's the role of a leader, senior leader in a company in all of this?
So I love the question, and it's something I think about every day. Our whole team does. Um, we've made some pretty good progress over the years getting some people to think about innovation in the way we've described. So it's not as if we're making no progress. We're making progress, but what we've even talked about recently is that you know some people are just more open to thinking the way we think about innovation. We talk about it, they go, that makes perfect sense. I get it. That's how I think. Let's go do it that way. But that's not everybody. And what we're trying to do is to figure out a way to take along the rest of the organization. And we think a lot of it simply has to do with a mindset shift.
Mm,
There's so many built-in myths and just the way people treat innovation. It's always been the same. Like innovation starts with an idea. Everybody's responsible for innovation. Customers have latent needs. Needs change quickly over time. I could go on and espouse 20 of these statements. None of them are true, but I hear them all every day.
yeah.
And getting people to stop believing things that aren't true is hard to do, right?
Well, that's particularly hard because some of those go all the way back to the education that we get, right?
But that's exactly right. So a lot of what we're working on is just some simple courses. Why don't we just call it the introductory course? But it's the sole goal. It's like an hour and a half course or so. Is to just change the mindset.
Mm,
Just so a different language. Just see it through a different lens, right? What does
yeah.
a market? What does a market look like when you look through this lens? What's a need look like? We've covered a lot of it today, but we're trying to organize it so it just changes the mindset so people can go, oh, I see there is another way. Now, they don't have to be masters and practitioners, right? But if they can just open their mind to that there is a better way and someone's going to give them this information
Yeah.
and here's what they should go do with it, that's great, right?
Yeah.
So just in terms, so the other half of your question, how can leaders help here? Um, leaders often ask the question, who's responsible for innovation? And the
Yes.
answer has to be everybody, right? But that's not true. There's actually very few people who are responsible for innovation, and management's one of them. Right? Management has to make sure that teams agree on what a need is, what a market is, what a segment is, what innovation is,
Yeah.
right? That's to me, that's management's role, right? They need to educate their organization so that they have a common language for innovation. They're all thinking about it the same way.
And when we say management in this case, I have to translate that to the hierarchy of the organization, right? So
Yeah.
in the product development space, we have often some kind of a governance team. That's the senior most management team, and it's cross-functional. It
Yeah.
starts there, I assume, but it has to also get to that middle level. I mean, we can't have middle management where the team members report to thinking differently about innovation. We really have to permeate this under the same understanding across the entire company.
That's exactly right. And it starts at the top, right?
Yes.
Because they have to understand that if they don't go along with this and disseminate this information in this fashion or insist that people have the right information at the right time to make the right decisions, then innovation will always be this unpredictable process, right?
Yeah.
So they have to get on board. And then the rest is just building out the practitioner set, right? You need, the way we do this internally within Strategyn, we have three key areas of practice. One is the project manager, who manages the entire event with the client. We have the qualitative researcher, who does all the outcome gathering. And then we have the quantitative researcher that puts together the survey and collects the data and analyzes it. And from there, then the product manager goes out to the teams with all the information. They do the ideation work and so on. So you don't need a ton of people to be practitioners, but you do need to change the mindset of most people. So right. I think that's really, the goal in the short term, to help make this adoption go a little bit faster than it has been over the last 30 years.
And we know mindsets are tough to change, right?
Yes.
So part of that is education, which sounds like you got all kinds of good plans for that. The other is proof. We need proof within close proximity to believe. I believe it when I see it. So you have a lot of stories. I mean, I even, as I'm reading your book, I see stories there that have to do with medtech as well. That's helpful. But I guess the person that still doubts, the person that is unsure, because it sounds like this means such a big change in the way that we think about things. What would you say to that person?
Yeah. They're not really changing so many things, right? Again, there's very few people responsible for innovation. There's already people out talking to customers. There's people doing quantitative research. There's people doing ideation. We're just asking them to substitute the information that is flowing through each of those processes to be a different set of information.
Yeah.
Say that's the difference, right? So
I love that.
So you could
we're
say
not necessarily asking for an additional huge investment. The mind shift is maybe focusing on it in a different way.
Right. We worked with a medical device company a couple of weeks back that said, we've done 60 interviews. We interviewed people all over the place to gather our set of needs. And they came to us with their set of needs, and they said, the unfortunate thing is we still don't know what the needs are. So we worked with them for about 6 hours. We talked to them, the team who collected all the needs, and we took them through our method, and we translated all of their statements into need statements, all their insights. So they walked away with, instead of 100 pages of stuff, they had 3 pages that stated all the 100 needs that are associated with getting the job done. And as we told them, you could do that in a couple of, we call them immersion sessions, where you just sit with the customer for 2, 3, 4 hours and cover all this information. Just go very slowly, nice pace, understand what the job is, create a job map, uncover all their outcomes. And you can do this in a fairly short period of time. So they said, so you mean to tell me that we didn't have to go to 60 different locations to do all these different interviews? Yeah. And they did them in person, by the way, because they felt like observation was such a critical thing.
Yeah.
And again, just none of that's true, right? The best thing to do is just to sit with folks for a good period of time and figure out, how do they measure success? Let them think about it outside of solution space, right? In fact, you're trying to keep them outside of solution space when you're going through these interviews.
Sure. Okay, so I have one more question, and then I promise you I won't keep expanding. This is a scope creep, but you just said something that totally brings up another question for you. The global environment, you said, okay, maybe we don't have to go to all the customers, but what do I do if I'm in, if I'm a global company and I know I have cultural differences, I have economic, social differences, how big a net do I have to cast out there?
Yeah, big, but I'll explain how to do it efficiently.
Yeah.
Because we work with mostly global companies, but what we'll often do is we'll do our qualitative research. In other words, capture all the needs in the US to start, or in English-speaking countries. And once we feel like we have a complete set of needs, then we take the complete set of needs and we'll put them in other geographies and do interviews. But the interviews aren't starting from scratch. We actually show them all the statements and say, do you agree? Are we missing any? Are they not understandable? Are they irrelevant or whatever? So what we do is we'll capture all of them in the US or in English speaking languages, and then we'll validate them in 10 other countries around the world.
Okay. So we do get a global view at the end, which is
right.
Really important, right?
That's right. In the end, what we want to say is that set of need statements has been validated with customers worldwide.
Yes.
And you want to do that before you go quantify them. Right.
Excellent.
And the same thing is true when you're doing the quantitative work. In a lot of cases, you may want to start in English-speaking countries and then add more as you go later on. But what we often find is that unmet needs that you see in the US are the same unmet needs you see in many other countries. There are some country-to-country differences, but they're generally a lot smaller than you might guess. And so you can build out a strategy that's more global in nature, which our clients love, because it's a pain to have a different strategy for every country, especially if you have different products in each country, which most clients would never do that, right?
Very good. Well, as I said, we could probably speak for a very long time. We're going to have to wrap up. I really appreciate this conversation. It has been inspiring, and I am quite sure that there are several listeners out there that would like to send some more questions in. So I want to invite those questions, and hopefully you and I can collaborate also afterwards, in case there are some things that we need to follow up on for based on those questions. I have one sort of I have two last questions for you. Okay, the first one, if we talked about a lot of different things, if there was one thing, one takeaway that you would want every leader to walk away with, what would that one takeaway be?
I would say, let's all agree on what a need is.
I love it. Okay. And
Very
then
simple.
the second one is, what's next for Tony?
Well, I mentioned the education and training component here. We're going all out on putting together a great training program so we can get a lot of practitioners operating within companies so that we can help change the way the world innovates.
Excellent. And I'm sure we will see and hear and experience more of that. Thanks so much, Tony.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Leaders Agenda podcast. You can continue the conversation with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter by following Action for Results.